Beat me in chess, and I'll give you $100 million. Lose, and your mother loses her job. If stories of redemption, justice, and the courage of the smallest voices touch your heart, please like and subscribe so you can stay with us until the very last chapter of this journey. The hourglass turned. Amber light pooled over the dark wood of the Whitmore Library. Enough seen, enough power. Carter Whitmore, 58, watched the first grains fall as if time itself were a hired gun. Linda Brooks stood behind her daughter, fingers knotted. Ava, 9, hair in a loose ponytail, took the chair with a steadiness learned from 100 quiet nights and one beloved teacher who worked steel by day and taught chess by evening. "White to move," Carter said. Ava reached forward and slid a pawn 2 squares. E4. Carter mirrored with E5, then added, almost kindly, "In business we call it synergy. Cut the unnecessary pawns, keep the power." Linda flinched. Ava didn't. Knights came out, bishops breathed. The board gathered purpose. To Carter, the table was a stage. He talked to fill the air. To Ava, it was a workshop. She listened for strain. Her grandfather had called it positional hearing, knowing where weight belongs. Carter struck the center. D5. Wood clicked. The air sharpened. Ava exchanged and re-knit the position with a small move that looked like nothing, felt like everything. She mapped candidate lines the way her grandfather had once drawn branching arrows on shop paper. If QH4+, then G3. If XD4, recapture and hold. If pressure mounts, aim for the D file. "Comfortable?" Carter asked. "It's a lot for a child." "I'm fine." A knight found D2. The hourglass hissed steadily. A breath later, the child squared her shoulders, ready for whatever came next. Carter castled and launched theater. Queen to H4, eyes on her king. "Nothing personal," he said. "Just the efficient route." G3, BE2, KG1. No flourish, just shelter. He offered an exchange in the center that looked generous. Linda heard only the scrape of wood and thought of rent. Ava heard structure, eased a pawn to C3, and the position settled into a hum. "You play slowly," Carter observed. "I play to the end." He smiled without warmth. The next few moves blurred, trade here, feint there, until a line appeared on the horizon. A queen sacrifice, the kind that turns rooms into theaters and opponents into afterthoughts. Carter angled for it piece by piece, confining, tempting, building. "Careful," Linda breathed. Ava studied not the threat, but the terms beneath it. Accepting would invite a storm. Declining would concede momentum. There was a third way her grandfather loved, an in-between move that reset the count. Her hand hovered over her queen, then her knight, then stopped at the D-pawn. Carter's eyebrow rose. Surely not. Ava advanced the pawn 1 square. It was a small sound with large consequences. Lines shifted. A crucial tempo appeared. The sacrifice's follow-up lost a tooth. Carter recalculated. He could still crash through, but the landing was worse. "Interesting," he said. He chose violence anyway. The queen lunged. The net descended. Ava accepted the spirit of the sacrifice, allowing the queen to bite, not the king to die. Her rook lifted, just enough. Her bishop stitched a square. Her king stepped and sat. The attack arrived and spilled, a storm that found drains. Carter pressed. Ava tidied. She aligned a rook behind the D-pawn. She refused to chase his queen. She tuned the position until the only notes that mattered were hers. "Who taught you to be stubborn?" Carter said lightly. "My grandfather taught me patience." And you think patience wins? It outlasts hurry. The hourglass thinned. Carter tried a rook swing. Ava dropped a knight onto a square that made the swing awkward. He regrouped. She nudged. He threatened. She made the threats run out of breath. She pushed the d-pawn again. No drama, no smile, just a cylinder of wood moving where it was meant to go. The file turned into a hallway with her name on it. The passed pawn wasn't born yet, but both players felt its future like a pressure change. "You'll never get that through," he said. Maybe. He disliked the word. He tightened lines around her king, forcing a shuffle to the corner, then grimaced when the sequence ended with his pieces stepping on each other's toes. Somewhere his own back rank had lost its dignity. Linda dared a breath. She watched her daughter set the next layer, rook behind pawn, king tucked, minor pieces guarding the ladder rungs. The board no longer looked like a spectacle. It looked like work done correctly. Carter reached for speed, his favorite resource. Speed gave him promotions, headlines, victories that looked inevitable after the fact. But speed against structure is a race against a wall. Ava didn't chase his story. She built hers. She made room for the pawn to pass. She tidied weaknesses he didn't think she saw. She used the clock to show she wasn't afraid of it. He tried one last idea, a tactical burst designed to trade her rook off the file. She answered with a Zwischenzug that forced the wrong recapture. When the dust cleared, her d-pawn stood truer than before, and his queen, so sure of herself, had fewer squares that mattered. Carter looked at Ava and saw calm where he expected awe. He looked at the board and, for a heartbeat, saw why calm won, because it went where it said it would, slowly, and arrived. He returned to calculation. The lines were there, but none of them gave him what he wanted, an ending on his terms. The hourglass showed a shallow crescent. Amber thinned. Outside, the Connecticut sky slipped toward evening. Inside, a child from Harlem sat perfectly still while a titan of finance ran out of easy moves. A pawn had moved, and with it, the balance of power. The rest would be technique and time. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, was a town carved from iron and fire. Though the smokestacks of Bethlehem steel had long grown cold, their silhouettes still rose against the Lehigh River like monuments to a vanished age. For Ava Brooks, 9 years old and already entangled in a billionaire's wager, this place was not just geography, it was ancestry, a living echo of her late grandfather, George Whitaker. George had been more than a steelworker. He had been a philosopher in coveralls, a man who believed that a chessboard could teach more about survival than any textbook. On Saturday afternoons, he'd gather a handful of children at the Moravian College Chess Club, chalk dust on his sleeves, and tell them, "Every pawn carries a dream. Protect it, advance it, and one day it may transform." For Ava, those words were gospel. She remembered sitting at his knee as he drew calculation trees on scraps of notebook paper, arrows branching like veins through a leaf. "You don't just look at one move, Ava," he'd say, tapping the page. "You look at candidate moves. Options are the oxygen of strategy. Without them, you suffocate." The memory pressed against her as she replayed the first encounter with Carter Whitmore in her mind. The billionaire had attacked with brute force, throwing his queen forward like a raider storming a village. It was dazzling, aggressive, but also reckless. George had warned her about such players. "They're hunters of material advantage," he'd said once, over a cracked chessboard balanced on the hood of his old Ford pickup. "They grab pieces like bankers grabbing accounts. But Ava, never mistake appetite for mastery. True strength is in positional play, sacrifices made with purpose, not vanity." Bethlehem was quieter now, its streets lined with shuttered factories and faded diners. Linda had brought Ava back for a weekend, needing distance from the suffocating wealth of Greenwich. They stayed in a modest row house not far from where George had lived his final years. The air smelled faintly of rust and rain, a perfume of labor long past. On Saturday morning, Ava walked to the Moravian College campus. The old chess club was still there, its linoleum floors scuffed, trophies gathering dust in glass cases. A new coach, a soft-spoken graduate student, welcomed her with curiosity, but it was the empty chair by the window, the chair where her grandfather had once sat, that held her attention. She placed her backpack on the floor, unzipped it, and set up the pieces on a board. The room was silent except for the rain tapping against the window. Ava whispered aloud as she played both sides, her voice steady. Pawn to d4. Black responds, nf6. Candidate moves, c4, nf3, e3. Calculate 3 plies ahead. Which structure holds? She could almost hear George correcting her posture, urging her to look deeper. Her fingers paused over the pawn. A d-file push was not glamorous, but it was consistent. It embodied patience, the very opposite of Carter's hunger for initiative at any cost. Linda watched her daughter from the doorway. The sight of Ava alone, murmuring to ghosts, tugged at her heart. She had scrubbed Whitmore's marble staircases for years, but this child of hers carried an inheritance no billionaire could purchase. "You remind me of your grandfather," Linda said softly when the session ended. Ava looked up, eyes shining. "Do you think he'd be proud?" "Proud?" Linda knelt, brushing hair from her daughter's forehead. "He'd say you're already stronger than the steel he once forged." That evening, Ava opened a worn composition notebook filled with diagrams her grandfather had drawn. One page bore the title in his slanted handwriting, The Quiet Revolution of Pawns. Below it, he had sketched multiple pawn structures, chains, isolated pawns, passed pawns, each annotated with notes like soul of position and patience is power. She traced the lines with her finger, feeling the weight of his lessons. In the battle against Carter, she realized, she had already seen the pattern. His raider style thrived on short-term initiative, on immediate gains. He lived for the kill shot, but like the steel plants that had collapsed under reckless takeovers, his style ignored the foundation. Ava smiled faintly. She would not fight fire with fire. She would fight fire with stone. The next morning, she and Linda visited the abandoned Bethlehem steel plant. Rain pooled in the cracked concrete, reflecting the hulking skeleton of industry. Ava stood at the gates, clutching the pawn her grandfather had carved for her from scrap wood. "He said pawns are like workers," she told her mother. "One alone is weak. Together they build the game." Linda squeezed her shoulder. "Then remember that when you sit across from him again." Ava nodded. She would. That night, she dreamed of a chessboard stretching across the floor of the steel mill. Pawns marched in steady ranks, each step echoing like the clang of hammers on metal. At the far end stood Carter, his queen gleaming, arrogant, commanding. He lunged forward, striking quickly, but every advance left cracks in his armor. And from those cracks, Ava's pawns pushed forward, unyielding, inevitable. She awoke with the certainty of someone who had glimpsed the future. Back in Greenwich days later, she set up the board in her room, studying Carter's preferred lines from memory. She recognized the rhythm: early queen forays, neglect of pawn structure, over-reliance on material advantage. She marked each flaw in her notebook, annotating with arrows and question marks the way George had taught her. At the bottom of the page, she wrote, "Against a raider, build fortresses. Use prophylaxis. Wait until his hunger eats him alive." Her hand hesitated, then she drew a final arrow from a humble pawn on the D-file to the 8th rank, where it transformed into a queen. She circled it, whispering, "This is the path." The next time she faced Carter, she would not fear him. She would not be dazzled by his wealth or shaken by his laughter. She would remember Bethlehem, the clang of steel, the lessons of her grandfather, the philosophy of patient pawns. And when the moment came, she would answer his raider fury with the quiet power of evolution. The penthouse on East 72nd Street rose like a black crown above Manhattan. Carter Whitmore's world was glass and steel, polished silence, and high stakes. But in the center of the room, beneath the weight of chandeliers and the buzz of the city far below, the only thing that mattered was a board of 64 squares resting on an obsidian table. The overhead lights struck the surface, throwing faint reflections of the skyline across its glossy black sheen. Ava Brooks sat across from him, her navy dress plain against the sharpness of the room. Linda lingered close, arms folded, eyes darting nervously from the pieces to Carter's smirk. For him, the setting was theater. For them, it was a battlefield. The clocks were set, 60 minutes each. Not blitz, but classical time. This was no contest of reflexes. It was patience, calculation, psychology. Carter preferred it that way. Longer games gave him more space to talk, to undermine, to whisper doubts into the air like poison. He leaned forward, sliding a pawn into place with a flourish. C5. The Sicilian defense. Not a beginner's playground. Ava responded with NF3, calm as ever. Her fingers did not tremble, though her feet barely touched the floor beneath the chair. Carter chuckled. Do you know what synergy means, Ava? It means trimming what slows you down, redundant staff, inefficient assets, pawns. Pawns are expendable. Linda stiffened. The words landed like knives, aimed not only at the board but at her employment. Ava, however, kept her gaze fixed on the squares, as if she hadn't heard him at all. She pushed D4, entering the open Sicilian, daring him to engage. He did. CXD4. She recaptured swiftly with her knight. The rhythm of the game began to build. Knights danced, bishops stretched across diagonals. Carter's pieces moved aggressively, thrusting forward like soldiers on borrowed time. Ava developed slowly, conserving her structure, obeying an inner discipline. You see, Carter went on, voice smooth. IQ wins, childhood doesn't matter. Talent is purchased with tutors, refined in Ivy League halls. Without those, you're only collateral. He moved his queen, sharp and sudden, toward her king's flank. The strike was early, theatrical, but meant to intimidate. Check. Ava blocked with G3, sliding the pawn with quiet certainty. The queen's threat evaporated. She tucked her bishop behind the shield, her king soon castled safely. Carter frowned slightly. He'd expected hesitation, perhaps panic. Instead, he found silence. Collateral, he repeated, almost to himself. That's all pawns are, replaceable. Redundant workers in a system too large to notice them. Linda's breath caught. Ava finally spoke, her voice even. And yet, pawns move first. The words startled Carter. He tried to mask it with a laugh, but something inside shifted. He pressed harder, launching his knight forward, creating a looming tension over Ava's queenside. Ava's hand lingered above her bishop before settling on C4, a quiet, developing move that guarded and probed at once. She didn't need to answer noise with noise. She had learned from Bethlehem that strength was not in showmanship, but in structure. Minutes passed. The sand in the clock fell steadily. Carter leaned back, arms crossed, narrating each shift of momentum. See? You've cornered yourself. Zugzwang is coming. Every move you make will weaken you. But Ava did not appear cornered. She kept her posture steady, eyes locked on the lines ahead. She could see his intentions. Material advantage, quick initiative, the Raiders' style. She let him lunge, let him posture, waiting for the storm to reveal its cracks. At one point he leaned closer, lowering his voice like a conspirator. "You can resign now. Keep your mother's job. Walk away with your dignity intact." Ava looked up, hazel eyes steady. "No deal." 3 words. Enough to cut through the theater. Linda clasped her hands, whispering a prayer. She saw the man across the table, 58, seasoned, predatory, trying to unnerve her daughter with decades of practiced cruelty. Yet Ava met him not with bravado, but with the discipline of silence. She was George Whitaker's granddaughter, and the steelworker's patience lived in her bones. The board flared again. Carter maneuvered his queen into the H-file, aligning for a king hunt. His bishops cut sharp diagonals, menacing. Spectators, fund managers, and assistants drawn by curiosity watched from the edges of the room. They expected Ava to wilt. Instead, she recentered her pieces. A knight back to D2, a rook sliding toward the center. She tightened her fortress. Carter's smile faltered. He pressed on. Sacrifices gleamed in his mind, combinations that would dazzle, break her lines, prove his dominance. He thought of corporate raids, of firms stripped bare, of victories counted in billions. Yet the girl across from him moved as if insulated from his storms, her pace deliberate, her structure unbroken. He muttered almost angrily, "Redundant pawns. They don't survive long." Ava touched the D-file pawn, considering. Her grandfather's voice echoed, "A pawn may be overlooked, but it carries the soul of the game." She advanced it, steady as breathing. The observers whispered. A child playing against a billionaire and holding her own. The move was quiet, but its meaning loud. She was building, not reacting. Carter lunged with Q4+, confident it would crack her. She slid her rook across the rank, a rook lift that looked defensive but quietly shifted the balance. The check fizzled. His queen, momentarily proud, now looked stranded. The room's silence thickened. Carter stared at the board, recalculating. For the first time, his swagger bent. The queen was too far, the pawns overextended, the position fragile. Ava's hazel eyes never left the pieces. "Sometimes the quietest moves decide everything," she said softly. He clenched his jaw, annoyed at the echo of her grandfather's wisdom in her voice. He pushed his rook forward, hoping aggression would mask doubt. She answered with restraint, covering the square, letting his piece feel trapped. The clock ticked. Carter tapped his fingers on the obsidian surface, the reflected skyline quivering with the vibration. He had meant to control her mind with words, with spectacle. But she had answered with silence, patience, and one stubborn pawn still advancing along the file. By the time the hourglass was half drained, Carter realized the truth he dared not speak. He was no longer certain he was teaching her a lesson. Perhaps, slowly, she was teaching him. The town car slipped off the West Side Highway and into the village, the February morning thin and bright. Ava Brooks pressed a palm to her coat pocket to feel the small wooden pawn her grandfather had carved. Beside her, Linda watched the city scroll by, lips moving with a prayer she didn't quite finish. When the driver stopped on West 10th Street, the brownstone looked ordinary, more home than temple. But as soon as they stepped inside, the air changed. Tick, tick, tick. Chess clocks murmured from distant tables, a soft metronome that made everything else feel extraneous. The faint, clean smell of varnish lingered in the old wood banisters and boards, a scent that said games had been won here and lost here, but always played seriously. A few members glanced up, then quickly away. Manhattan had learned to be discreet. Word had traveled, of course. A billionaire. A child. A wager too large to be reasonable and too simple to ignore. But Marshall Chess Club, for all its stories, preferred the ceremony of set pieces and quiet clocks to the noise of spectacle. Carter Whitmore entered with a coat still smelling of cold air, hair combed to an immaculate part, the understated tie that insisted on seriousness. He nodded to the director, accepted a notation sheet he would never use, and took his seat across from Ava. "Good morning," he said, voice mild. Ava mirrored the nod. No one bowed to anyone. They bent only to the 64 squares. The set was classic Staunton, the board modest and well-used. The timer's red flags clicked down to 0 and sprang back up again in a cyclic rehearsal that felt both patient and inexorable. Linda settled into a chair just behind her daughter. The director checked the clock settings, then pressed the button. The match began. E4 from Ava again. E5 from Carter again. The symmetry was a statement. Power faced resolve. Nothing conceded, nothing new. Yet even inside familiar openings, the ground can shift. Knights developed. Bishops claimed diagonals. Carter's rooks blinked awake. Like a practiced corporate raid, he probed early, tested her guardrails, then sprinted toward the queen's side with a minority attack, pawns trundling forward to break her structure by force. Ava answered not with counter-spectacle, but with prophylaxis. She nudged a pawn to h3 to deprive a knight of its favorite square. She tucked a bishop back to keep a diagonal clean. She slid her king one safe step, a gesture that said not yet, not your file, not your timing. Carter's lips hinted at a smile. He loved a target that believed it could endure him, because endurance could be tricked into passivity. When his queenside pawns made contact with her chain and the files opened, he leaned in, eyes alight. The veteran smell of varnish rose when his elbow brushed the table's edge. Tick, tick, tick. Ava would later remember that rhythm as the sound of her own calm. She placed a rook on a half-open file, then another behind the first. The clubroom felt closer now, the tables in her peripheral vision blurring into a long, dark wave of grain. She could hear her grandfather's voice, gloves off, tin lunch pail still on the bench, saying that patience isn't slow, it's exact. Carter swung a rook laterally, lining it up behind his queen for a king hunt born on the queen side but lunging toward the center. The maneuver invited calculation, 1,000 forcing moves fogging the mind. Ava stepped back from the fog and looked at the map. This is where her position ended and his began. She broke the border not with a blow, but an in-between move. He threatened a capture on c4 that would shatter her camp. Before answering the threat directly, she found her Zwischenzug, a precise check that forced his king off its best square and robbed his follow-up of bite. The spectators, few as they were, did not gasp. They nodded without moving. This was what the club existed for. Carter sat very still. Only his eyes moved. Left, right, the famous diagonal. The new king square did not ruin him, but it uncoiled a spring he had wound carefully. He exhaled through his nose and recaptured on c4 anyway, refusing to admit that the beat had changed. The board's center loosened. Ava took a breath that went all the way down and put a rook on the third rank. A rook lift, the quiet hoist of a ladder rather than a battering ram. It looked like defense. It was mobility. Carried by that ladder, her rook could pivot to defend or invade without fanfare. Carter's glance slid toward her d-pawn and flashed contempt. The look said what his mouth didn't. That pawn will never get through. He returned to his queenside plan, pushing the last lever. Wood clicked. Files yawned. His bishop pair flared. Ava's hand hovered over that very pawn. She wasn't thinking of heroics. She was thinking of logistics. How to keep squares plugged, how to keep rooks coordinated, how to keep the idea alive long enough to matter. Her grandfather's notes had called it preparing the road, and the metaphor had survived the years. You do not shove a truck into a forest, you cut a path and grade it. The pawn stepped forward. Tick, tick, tick. Carter's knight hopped to c5 with a swagger that promised tactics. His queen leaned into the center. Ava saw a problem. If she grabbed the bait on b5, she would open lines for his rooks. If she refused it, she would invite a squeeze. She chose a third option, the kind that separates calculation from comprehension. She massaged a bishop backward, offering nothing, covering everything. Prophylaxis again, removing one future before it was born. Minutes thinned to inches in the clocks. A sheen gathered on Carter's forehead. He was working now, not parading. He found a sequence that traded into an endgame where his bishops might bully her knights, if only he could neutralize the rook lift and fence the d-pawn. He lunged for the trade, counting on reflex. Ava declined the first exchange with a waiting move only strong because of what she had already arranged. Rooks doubled. King nearer to the center than appearances confessed, and squares around the pawn controlled by pieces that weren't obvious. The declined trade looked rude. It was exact. Carter's lips pressed into a line. He tried again, this time sneaking a tactic that would fork her rook and bishop, unless she lost time first. Another Zwischenzug. Not a check now, but a capture with tempo. The order of moves changed the story. His fork vanished into the past. Good, the director murmured under his breath several tables away to no one in particular. Ava pushed the d-pawn again. It wasn't a charge, it was an appointment kept. The pawn became passed, not because it was brave, but because the board had been asked, square by square, to agree to it. Carter leaned back and stared at the ceiling as if the answer might be lacquered there. He had brought cavalry and torches. He now needed a locksmith. He did what smart men do when their plans falter. He tried to be smarter. He rounded up the pawn with long pieces and tightened the ring. Ava's rook on the third rank stutter-stepped sideways and then up, covering the entry squares. Her other rook took a waiting square that created a corridor for the king. She inhaled, exhaled, and did nothing heroic. It looked like she was refusing glory. She was, in truth, protecting it. Tick, tick, tick. With time running thin, Carter staked everything on geometry. A bishop swing to pin, a rook to the seventh, a queen infiltration, each idea good alone, misaligned together. He had always preferred the shimmer of initiative to the weight of structure. Now shimmer met weight and lost. Ava checked him once, only once, to force his king a step farther from the queening square. She then covered a flight square with a knight that had done almost nothing all game and was suddenly essential. The pawn reached the seventh. Carter's eyes cut sideways to Ava, searching for celebration, for the tremor of triumph that leads to carelessness. She offered him nothing. Her breathing didn't change. Her posture didn't lift. Only the smell of varnish seemed stronger, or perhaps his senses had sharpened to give the room back its material truth. He fired a final sequence at her king, chasing checks like a day trader chases flickers, hoping the market would move if he moved enough. She slid the king one square and placed the rook behind the pawn, where it had wanted to be all along. The clocks bled under a minute. Somewhere in the club, a door opened and closed with an old hinge sigh. Carter's rook darted behind her king for a skewer that would be beautiful if the board had been 5 moves younger. It wasn't. Ava paused long enough to be sure, then placed her rook with a soft, centered click. The skewer reversed. His rook had no square that wasn't a concession. He made one last capture to feign activity. She answered with a move that wasn't even forcing, just truer. He stared at the passed pawn. No words, only the slightest tilt of the head, as if he were listening to the sound of his own plan finishing itself without him. tick. Ava's hand hovered, then pushed. The quiet promotion was not the scene's climax. The climax had passed 10 moves ago when she chose patience over glory and order over noise. The new queen appeared because the board had already accepted her. Linda's shoulders loosened. The director looked at the clock and then at the final arrangement with the fondness of a carpenter for a well-fitted joint. Carter set his king on a safe square that wasn't safe anymore. Ava's rook lifted the last step, ladder to the roof, roof to the sky, and the tactics that had promised spectacle shrank into footnotes under the larger sentence she had written. He extended a hand. His face was composed, the smallest muscle in his cheek betraying surprise that felt older than pride. She shook it. The club's clocks went on ticking. The smell of varnish went on reminding the room that games outlast players and truths outlast games. Ava tucked the carved pawn back into her pocket as if returning a tool to its place, and the morning, newly washed by quiet, moved forward. The Marshall Chess Club was no longer a sanctuary of quiet calculation. It had become an arena. Camera rigs crowded the back wall, their red lights glowing like watchful eyes. Boom mics hovered just out of frame, catching every whisper. Reporters leaned forward with pens already moving, eager to capture the humiliation of a titan. On a mounted screen, a Bloomberg ticker scrolled mercilessly. Whitmore Capital CEO faces 100 million chess wager. Ava Brooks, 9 years old, sat in the same leather chair she had occupied before, her feet dangling just above the floor. Her hazel eyes scanned the 64 squares with a focus so steady it made the room itself seem still. Beside her, Linda clasped her hands together, the knuckles pale. She wanted to hold her daughter, to protect her from the weight of so many stares, but she knew this was Ava's fight. Across the table, Carter Whitmore shifted in his chair. His tailored suit could not mask the sweat at his collar. He had faced senators and hostile boards without blinking, but this was different. A child's hand on the pieces unsettled him more than the threat of regulators ever had. He had expected a spectacle he could dominate. Instead, he found himself trapped in one. The clock ticked. Carter's fingers drummed against the edge of the table, the rhythm betraying nerves he would never admit. His queen and bishops sprawled far from safety, a net designed for a king hunt that had come up empty. His pawns, once menacing, now stood overextended like towers built on sand. Ava's rook was behind her d-pawn, steady, inevitable. Her next move slid into place with a sound that cut through the room. D7, D8's Q. The pawn, humble and patient, transformed. "Promotion," she said softly. The word landed heavier than any headline. Gasps rippled through the spectators. The cameras whirred closer. On the Bloomberg feed, the headline updated in real time. Ava Brooks promotes pawn, Whitmore on brink of defeat. Carter stared at the board, his lips pressed into a thin line. He still had material, still had moves, but the narrative was gone. His king crouched on the back rank, hemmed in by his own army, the air around it suffocating. He tried to summon the arrogance that had carried him through decades, but all he could see was a pawn. No, a queen, that should never have survived long enough to matter. He made one more move, a rook sliding desperately across the 7th rank. Ava responded instantly. QE8+. "Check," she whispered. Carter countered with a bishop, his hands trembling as he set it down. Ava's rook lifted with clinical precision, climbing the file like a ladder against a crumbling wall. Rook G3, G8. The attack was simple, brutal, final. Check again. The silence in the room was absolute. Only the cameras dared to hum. Carter moved his king corner to corner, a trapped monarch among broken soldiers. Ava followed with her queen, sealing every escape. The crowd knew what was coming before Carter did. One last move. Quote 5 zwash. Her voice steady, almost too quiet to hear. Checkmate. The room exhaled all at once. The cameras surged forward, capturing the final position. Carter's king, smothered on the back rank, boxed in by his own pawns and the child's pieces. A king imprisoned not by force, but by his own hubris. The ticker blazed, checkmate. Whitmore defeated by 9-year-old in 100 Bammaus game. Carter slumped back in his chair, pale under the lights. For the first time in his life, words failed him. He had built an empire on intimidation, on the illusion of inevitability, and now, before investors, journalists, and strangers, he was undone by silence and patience. Reporters shouted, "Mr. Whitmore, will you honor the wager? Is this symbolic of Whitmore Capital's predatory tactics? What does this loss mean for your investors?" Carter opened his mouth, but no sound came. His jaw clenched. His hand tightened around the armrest as though he might crush the leather. But the cameras had already shifted away from him. The story was no longer his. It was Ava's. Microphones stretched across the table toward the girl who barely reached the edge. "How did you learn to play like this?" one asked. "What does this victory mean to you?" another pressed. Ava looked down at the board. Her small fingers rested on the queen she had just promoted, the piece that had carried her across the threshold of history. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply said, "My grandfather taught me that pawns are the soul of the game." The words traveled faster than any market signal. By evening, they would be quoted on financial blogs, replayed on news channels, scribbled in editorials. A child's definition of dignity had pierced through the armor of Wall Street. Linda rushed forward and wrapped her daughter in her arms. Tears streaked her face, but her embrace was steady, protective. "You did it, Ava," she whispered. "You really did." Ava leaned into her mother's shoulder, but her eyes drifted back to the board. She wasn't thinking about money or headlines. She was thinking about her grandfather in Bethlehem, about the dusty boards and notebooks where he had sketched pawn structures and whispered lessons. She was thinking about promises not yet kept. Carter rose slowly from his chair, every movement heavy. His face was ashen under the camera lights. He gathered his coat without looking at anyone, but just before he reached the door, he turned. His eyes locked with Ava's. For the briefest second, something flickered behind the shame. Recognition. He saw her not as a child, not as an opponent, but as a mirror. And then he left, the cameras following like vultures. Outside, the story exploded. Headlines shouted across the globe. "Billionaire humbled by Maid's daughter." The $100 million checkmate. Whitmore's empire shaken by child prodigy. Investors debated whether the humiliation would rattle Whitmore Capital's stock. Some whispered that the loss was more than symbolic, that it revealed cracks in a man whose empire thrived on invulnerability. Others mocked him mercilessly. Hashtags surged. Hashtag checkmate. Whitmore. Hashtag power of pawns. In a modest Harlem apartment that night, Ava and Linda sat over mugs of hot cocoa. The television replayed her checkmate again and again. Ava rested the carved wooden pawn on the table beside her, the one her grandfather had whittled years ago. She traced its worn edges with her thumb, silent. Linda brushed her daughter's hair back and whispered, "He won't forget this." Ava shook her head softly. "Neither will I." But it isn't finished. It was never about money. It's about what comes next. The cameras outside had recorded a humiliation, but in Ava's eyes, the real game, the one her grandfather had begun in a steel town years ago, was just getting started. The Whitmore Capital offices on 6th Avenue were built to inspire fear. Walls of glass stretched over the skyline, the trading floor below pulsing with screens and numbers. In Carter Whitmore's corner suite, silence pressed heavier than any ticker. The man who once dictated the fate of markets now sat hunched over a folder, his empire shaken not by a rival fund, but by a 9-year-old girl with hazel eyes. It should have ended with humiliation. Yet Carter found himself unable to let go. There was something about the girl's resilience, her silence, her refusal to bow, that unsettled him. And so he did what he always did when threatened. He ordered a background check. "Run it deep," he told his head of compliance, sliding Linda Brooks' name across the desk. "Mother and daughter, every record. I want it airtight." The man hesitated. "This is unusual, sir. Forensic diligence. On your housekeeper?" Carter's eyes narrowed. "Call it a personal investment. No leaks." Days later, the report arrived. Stacks of public filings, faded employment records, addresses tracing back through Pennsylvania. Carter pored over them with the intensity of a man searching for weaknesses in a balance sheet. And then he saw it. Bethlehem. Whitaker. The name stirred memory like dust rising from an abandoned factory floor. George Whitaker, listed as Ava's maternal grandfather, former employee of Bethlehem Steel. Carter leaned back, pulse quickening. He had heard that name before, years ago, in the context of an acquisition file buried deep in Whitmore Capital's archives. He called for the older files. Within hours, a banker's box was on his desk, filled with contracts from the 1990s. Carter slid open a worn folder marked Lehigh Valley Assets, Hostile Takeover. The pages told a story not of triumph, but of ruin. Whitmore Capital had orchestrated a hostile takeover of a series of steel satellite plants in Pennsylvania. The strategy had been textbook: identify distressed assets, strip them for cash, terminate pensions, flip the remains to overseas buyers. Profits soared, lives shattered. Among the names in the liquidation roster was George Whitaker. Termination date, 1998. Pension forfeited. Severance minimal. Carter swallowed hard. He remembered now, the day his father, Robert Whitmore, returned from Harrisburg with a grin. "We did it, son. Took the valley apart piece by piece. Bank signed off this morning." Carter had been 30 then, still learning the dark art of leverage. He had celebrated the deal as a masterstroke, never once considering the faces behind the numbers. Now those faces had a name. George Whitaker. The same man who had taught Ava to see pawns not as expendable, but as the soul of the game. Carter opened another folder. A photograph slipped out, yellowed at the corners. His father shaking hands with a bank administrator in front of the shuttered steel plant. Behind them, workers stood like ghosts, grim, hollow-eyed, robbed of their livelihoods. Carter's father looked triumphant, a conqueror posing over ruins. For the first time in decades, Carter felt something foreign stir in his chest. Shame. He pressed the photo flat against the desk, running his thumb over the faces in the background. Were one of them George Whitaker? Was he there that day, watching everything he'd built vanish with the stroke of a pen? The thought pierced deeper than any boardroom defeat. Restlessness drove Carter onto the highway 2 days later. He left behind his chauffeur, his security detail, the insulation of power. Alone in a black sedan, he drove west through Pennsylvania, past the fading towns that once pulsed with steel. Harrisburg greeted him with gray skies and government buildings of sandstone and glass. He requested access to public archives, combing through Department of State filings, annual reports, dissolution notices, bankruptcy schedules. The paper trail confirmed what he already knew. Whitmore Capital had engineered the collapse of a community to enrich itself. At a diner near the Capitol, he sat alone with a mug of coffee gone cold, the weight of history pressing on him. Around him, men with lined faces and heavy hands spoke in low voices about shifts at warehouses, about pensions that had never come, about promises broken. For the first time, Carter wondered if the enemy he had always imagined, the faceless competition, the anonymous market, wasn't the real adversary at all. Perhaps it was himself. That night, back in his hotel room, Carter opened the folder again. The photograph glared up at him. His father's smile looked different now, cruel in its triumph. He closed his eyes and saw Ava pushing her pawn, quiet and steady, carrying the soul of the game forward. His father had stripped families of their pawns, their security, their futures. And here, decades later, the granddaughter of one of those families had returned to strip him of his illusions. He set the photo down and reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the speed dial, trembling with a hesitation he had not felt since he was a boy. Then, with a sharp breath, he pressed. The call rang. Linda's voice, startled, answered. "Mr. Whitmore?" Carter's voice cracked. "Linda, we need to talk. Tomorrow." For the first time in years, Carter Whitmore did not sound like a man issuing orders. He sounded like a man searching for forgiveness. The walk-up on 127th Street was nothing like the marble corridors Carter Whitmore had known all his life. The hallway smelled faintly of detergent and cooking oil. Children's voices echoed from the stairwell, and the air carried the hum of a city struggling to breathe. Carter climbed slowly, without bodyguards, without his chauffeur waiting outside. His expensive shoes felt out of place against the cracked linoleum. For the first time in decades, he arrived not as a conqueror, but as a supplicant. Linda Brooks opened the door cautiously. Her eyes widened at the sight of him. No entourage, no arrogance, only a man in a gray overcoat holding a leather briefcase. "Mr. Whitmore?" she whispered. "Linda," he said, voice unsteady. "May I come in?" Behind her, Ava looked up from the small kitchen table where she had been sketching chess positions on scrap paper. Her hazel eyes locked onto him, neither afraid nor impressed, only curious. The apartment was modest. 2 rooms, walls patched with layers of paint, books stacked in corners. Carter sat in a worn chair while Linda stood across from him, arms folded. "You've had your games," she said sharply. "Why are you here?" Carter opened the briefcase. Inside were documents, thick, official, stamped with notaries. He placed them carefully on the table. "I came to settle the wager," he said, "but not with a check. Money alone doesn't mend what I've broken." Linda frowned. "What do you mean?" Carter slid the first document forward. "This is an escrow agreement. $100 million placed beyond my reach, held by an independent agent. And this," he set down a second folder, "is the trust instrument. Irrevocable. Established in the name of George Whitaker." Ava leaned forward, whispering, "My grandfather's name." "Yes," Carter said softly. "He was a steelworker. My company's takeover cost him everything. This trust will reverse some of that harm. Its purpose is to support family-owned businesses, to shield them from hostile acquisitions like the one that destroyed Bethlehem Steel's satellites. The beneficiaries are communities, not shareholders." Linda's breath caught. "Why?" "Because restitution is not a favor," Carter answered, voice low. "It is a debt." He turned to Ava. "You reminded me that pawns have value, that workers, families, small businesses, they are not expendable. This trust will stand, independent of me, with its own board. 3 members, none controlled by Whitmore Capital. It will disburse 4.5% annually. Permanently. The language was technical, but Ava understood enough. "You're changing the rules," she said. "Yes," Carter admitted. "For once." Linda shook her head, tears brimming. "I cleaned your floors for 10 years, Mr. Whitmore. I watched you walk past me like I was invisible. Why should I believe this is anything more than guilt?" Carter met her gaze. "Because guilt fades. This will not. The trust is irrevocable. Even if I tried to undo it, the law would not allow me." He slid the pen across the table. "I need you to sign as a trustee, to guard it from me." Linda froze. The pen in her hand felt heavier than steel. She looked at Ava, who gave a small nod. With trembling fingers, Linda signed. The weight shifted instantly. This was no longer Carter's promise. It was binding law. Carter leaned back, almost exhaling in relief. There, the first repair. But Ava tilted her head, eyes sharp. "And what about Whitmore Capital?" The question hung in the air. Carter swallowed. "That is harder. The board lives on profit. But perhaps I can teach them another game." "You must," Ava said. Her voice, though soft, cut like a blade. "Because if pawns matter here, they must matter there too." For a moment, Carter stared at her, this child who spoke like a judge, like the conscience he had buried years ago. Then, slowly, he nodded. The rest of the evening passed in a fragile quiet. Papers signed, explanations given. Linda poured tea into mismatched mugs. Carter accepted his with both hands, as if holding something sacred. Through the window, Harlem's night lights flickered. For the first time in years, Carter felt the hum of life beyond the towers of wealth. When he rose to leave, Ava walked him to the door. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Yes, Ava?" Her hazel eyes shone. "You fixed one thing. What will you fix next?" The question pierced deeper than any checkmate. He didn't have the answer yet. But for the first time, he wanted to find it. Later that night, in his limousine back to Manhattan, Carter stared at the city through the tinted glass. The documents in Linda's hands would outlive him. The trust would stand long after his reputation had faded. And he realized something strange. For once, he felt lighter. Not victorious, not powerful, but human. The boardroom buzzed with an artificial stillness, the kind created not by silence but by fluorescent lights humming above polished steel fixtures. Glass pitchers of water caught the glow and split it into small prisms that danced across the slide deck on the wall. The surface of the long table did not mirror the world as an obsidian slab might. It absorbed it, holding the tension of a dozen decision-makers waiting for Carter Whitmore to speak. Carter sat at the head, his tie knotted but slightly loose, hands folded. It was a pose that once conveyed command. Today it looked more like endurance. Around him, directors prepared for combat in their own ways, adjusting binders, opening tablets, clicking pens. Near the door, two guests sat upright, representatives from Cal STRS and NYSTRS, pension funds with billions under management and the moral weight of school teachers and state workers on their shoulders. Their presence shifted the tone. This wasn't just about margin. It was about scrutiny. At the far end, a chair almost too large for her frame held 10-year-old Ava Brooks. She was officially an observer. No voting rights, a child among suits. But her notebook lay on the table, closed, as if it carried its own gravity. The CFO began his presentation with the briskness of someone rehearsed 100 times. Toledo Packaging, target profile, regional, fragmented. Consolidation brings efficiency. Projected headline number, 14% E/TDA lift by year 2. Slides clicked forward. Bar charts grew taller. Arrows surged upward. Execution levers, he continued. Redundancies eliminated, management layers streamlined, supplier contracts renegotiated, $80 million in annualized savings. Poison pill absent, standstill unlikely. Cap table friendly with a modest tender premium. Everyone in the room knew the translation. Layoffs, plant closures, quick wins dressed as synergies. The chairman leaned forward. We've been too slow this year. Let's not miss another window. A director nodded. Closing before Q4 guidance would calm the street. Another muttered, retention grants needed. Section 280G exposure. The jargon rolled off their tongues like code words for sacrifices that would never touch them. Carter listened, his jaw tight, then finally said, let's hear all the options. The CFO shifted to a slide labeled Synergies. He didn't need to elaborate. The word was a guillotine. At the end of the table, Ava opened her notebook. The small sound cut through the air more than any gavel. Pages filled with sketches, arrows, and notes slid into view. She rose, her head barely above the tabletop, and walked toward the projector. The chairman frowned. We're in the middle of a presentation. Carter didn't move. Let her speak. Ava set the notebook down beside the laptop, careful not to disturb the cables. On the page was a simple chessboard diagram. Beneath it, in round handwriting, 2 ways to win. This, she said, pointing at the first diagram, is what you're planning. Cut pieces to free the big ones. It can work, but the structure weakens. You save time and lose shape. The CFO crossed his arms. We aren't here for metaphors. Then don't hear a metaphor, Ava replied calmly. Hear rules. She flipped the page. Draft a partnership term sheet. Promise no layoffs for 24 months. Replace golden parachute bonuses with a profit-sharing pool tied to EBITDA, capped so debt service is safe. Enter a standstill agreement that prevents hostile moves while both parties meet ESG goals. Worker safety, boiler upgrades, wastewater treatment. You still expand. You still modernize. But you don't burn people to do it. A director let out a short laugh. We're not a charity. The Cal STRS representative lifted a hand. We're fiduciaries with long horizons. Labor stability lowers volatility. If you insist on early layoffs, you face headline risk and higher discount rates. Covenants can be value accretive. NISTRS added, our committees are under public pressure. Include community impact covenants, apprenticeships, retraining, local procurement, and we can defend the position. The room shifted. Even the CFO's shoulders stiffened. Partnerships, surrender control, he pressed. Ava shook her head. They share it. You still set strategy. But the plant manager knows where a wrench slips. Both sides promise, both sides watch. Enforceable how? Another director asked. Ava turned to another page. Escrow performance earnouts. Release funds on audited milestones. Add a clawback if layoffs happen without a material adverse event. Independent monitors file quarterly reports. If covenants fail, the standstill lifts and you can pursue alternatives. The chairman scoffed. Are we a social enterprise now? Carter's voice was quiet but firm. We're a company that wants customers for 20 years, not 2. The CFO countered. Street won't applaud a slower ramp. Some will, Cal STRS said. The ones who stay. The tension held like a held breath. Fingers tapped once, then stopped. Run the cost of capital numbers, a director offered. What's the delta? NYSDRS leaned in. If you bind covenants and retention improves, we'll extend duration. That lowers your capital cost. You stop selling to tourists. Ava slid a page forward, this one neatly tabulated. No layoff covenant, 24 months. Exceptions for regulator-ordered shutdowns. Profit sharing, 5 to 8% of operating profit into a worker pool. Board comp reduced proportionately. CapEx commitment, ergonomic and automation upgrades. Auditor verified. Community metrics, apprenticeships, vendor diversity, IRIS plus indicators published. Governance, independent mediation panel, joint monitors, public quarterly reports. Exit, breach triggers standstill lapse. Sale or poison pill permitted. These aren't ornaments, Ava said. They're rails. They keep the train upright. The CFO pressed again. And if a recession slams volume? Write it, Ava said. Trigger clause. If EBITDA falls below floor 2 quarters straight, the pool shrinks and covenants loosen. But don't make people the first lever. The chairman leaned back. We've built our name on leverage. And reputation, Carter said. Bethlehem's photo files still burned in his memory. If we earn lower capital costs by not wrecking assets, that's finance, not philanthropy. The room shifted again. Some directors studied the child's notebook more intently than the CFO's slides. Cal's TRS spoke softly. We'll issue a support letter if these terms hold. The market listens to pensions. NYSTRS nodded. File a Form 8K after signing. Be transparent. Reg FD is circling. The chairman muttered, We're letting an elementary schooler dictate precedent. Ava's reply was gentle. I'm not dictating. I'm reminding you there's more than one way to win. Carter nodded. Call the question. Before votes, the General Counsel interjected. We'll also add a conflict of interest policy, given the Whitaker Trust. Governance walls, no related party contracts, transparency is essential. Do it, Carter said. Hands rose slowly, beads on a wire. 6 in favor, 4 opposed. Motion carried. The CFO snapped his laptop shut, controlled frustration in the gesture. We'll need a new model. Build it, Carter said, and draft a letter to employees and the town. No spin, plain terms. The pension reps gathered their papers. Cal STRS rubbed his temples. If you deliver, others will copy. NYSTRS added, if you don't, they'll call it theater. The door closed, and the hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence. Carter looked to Ava. You just rewrote how we play this game. Ava shut her notebook. No. We agreed to play a longer one. For the first time in years, Carter smiled without armor. Those are the ones worth winning. Above them, the hum of lights stayed steady, ordinary. But around the table, the air felt different, as if the game itself had tilted. It was not another game. When Ava Brooks returned to the Marshall Chess Club, the Staunton sets remained untouched. No clocks ticked, no pawns marched. Instead, a lectern had been set in the center of the room, and rows of chairs stretched where boards normally lay. A modest banner read, How Pawns Become Queens. A talk by Ava Brooks. For the girl who had once sat small and silent across from a billionaire, this was something new. She was not here to defend a king or promote a pawn. She was here to speak, to teach. The audience was a mixture of chess enthusiasts, financial journalists, and community leaders curious about the child who had forced Whitmore Capital to rethink its doctrine. When Ava stepped forward, clutching the wooden pawn her grandfather had carved, the room hushed. My grandfather told me, she began, that pawns are the soul of the game. He worked in steel until a company stripped his plant apart. He never saw himself as expendable. Neither should we. On this board and in our lives, every piece has a path. The words were simple, childlike even, but they carried a weight that startled the room. Not because they were polished, but because they were honest. For once, Marshall Chess Club was not a sanctuary for tactics, but for conscience. The next morning, newspapers from New York to Los Angeles ran with headlines. From pawn to voice, Ava Brooks speaks at Marshall. The child who humbled Whitmore calls for dignity in business. If her checkmate had been a spectacle, this was something subtler, a philosophy made public. It was also fuel for skeptics who thought Carter Whitmore's transformation was theater. The Financial Tribune sneered, "A billionaire parroting a child's metaphors is hardly a strategy. Investors deserve profit, not parables." Cable anchors debated whether people first profit was a smokescreen. Hedge fund managers called it weakness. The stock wavered, dipping double digits in a single day before clawing back. Volatility became the story. Carter sat in his Boston townhouse, looking out at the Charles River. The shimmering water was calm, but the markets were not. On the table before him lay a draft of his shareholder letter. He had written and erased the same sentence half a dozen times. Profit is not abandoned, it is redefined. Was it enough? Or was he, as critics claimed, merely staging penance? The pressure sharpened when a courier arrived at Whitmore Capital headquarters with an SEC subpoena. The cover letter was terse. Disclosure of trust governance, potential conflicts of interest, immediate response required. Inside were demands for documents, Form 8K filings, trustee rosters, wire records, all tied to the George Whittaker Trust. For decades, Carter had bent regulators to his will with armies of lawyers. Now the same apparatus pressed against him. Whistleblower hotlines lit up with anonymous complaints. Some alleged that the trust was a cover to funnel assets off balance sheet. Others claimed Carter had structured it for tax arbitrage. The irony stung. The very thing he had built to restore faith now looked like a liability. In an effort to reclaim control, Carter invited the Harvard Negotiation Project to run an internal workshop at Whitmore Capital. The boardroom that once echoed with synergies and redundancies now carried the smell of whiteboard markers and coffee cups. Professors and mediators arranged chairs in a circle, a layout more therapy than strategy. On the board, the lead mediator wrote a single question. What does winning mean? The directors shifted uneasily. One muttered, maximizing shareholder returns. Another said, dominance. A third, beating competitors to market. Carter sat silent. He thought of Bethlehem, of Ava's small hand advancing a pawn. At the back of the room, Ava raised her hand. She had been invited only as an observer, yet the silence beckoned her. Winning, she said softly, means leaving the board better than you found it. The room froze. Some directors scoffed, but others, Cal STRS, NYSTRS, leaned forward. Their pens still. The mediator circled the phrase on the board, underlining it twice. Perhaps, he said, that is the hardest negotiation of all, between profit and conscience. Meanwhile, Washington's scrutiny deepened. Carter flew to D.C. to testify before an SEC panel. He entered the chamber not in triumph, but in resolve, documents in hand, Ava and Linda watching from the gallery. Microphones clicked on. The commissioner's voice cut sharp. Mr. Whitmore, you built your fortune dismantling companies. Why should we believe this trust is anything but reputational laundering? Carter leaned forward, hands steady on the table. Because I've bound myself to law. The George Whittaker Trust is irrevocable. I cannot dissolve it, cannot profit from it. Its sole beneficiaries are communities harmed by the very takeovers that enriched me. If you distrust me, then trust the legal architecture that cages me. The panel pressed harder. What about conflicts of interest? Related party transactions? He handed over the governance charter. Independent trustees, strict conflict policies, clawbacks. He admitted plainly, yes, the trust was born of guilt, but guilt is irrelevant if the structure delivers protection. Law, not intent. We'll measure it. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, microphones thrust forward. Is this a revolution in capitalism? Are you the first raider to repent? Is Whitmore Capital stable enough to survive this shift? Carter said nothing. He walked past them into the cold air, eyes fixed, Ava clutching his sleeve. Back in Boston, the storm reached its peak. Financial channels mocked, boardroom circus, Billionaire takes advice from a fifth grader. Analysts issued sell ratings. The stock dropped 12% in one day, clawed back 8% the next. Volatility was its own verdict. Carter knew the markets craved certainty. He could not give it. But he could give truth. So he published the shareholder letter. It was unlike anything he had written. No glossy charts, no empty forecasts, just words. Our future lies not in plunder but in loyalty. Profit is not weaker when workers thrive, it is stronger. The Whitaker Trust is not charity, it is restitution. Our new strategy, people first profit, will be our legacy. The letter spread across terminals and blogs. Some derided it as naivete. Others, especially pensions and impact funds, called it visionary. Ava read it aloud at the Harlem apartment, her voice catching on the phrase legacy. Linda wept quietly, whispering, "Your grandfather would have understood." One evening, Carter and Ava sat together at the Central Park Chess and Checkers house, away from cameras. Tourists walked past, unaware. Pieces lay scattered, a game half played. "Why write the letter?" Ava asked. Carter studied the board. "Because silence is complicity. I've been silent too long." "Do you think they'll believe you?" she asked. "They don't need to," he replied, advancing a knight. "They just need to see the board change." Ava smiled faintly and pushed a pawn, the sound soft in the twilight. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived at the Harlem apartment. Embossed on the corner, Marshall Chess Club. Addressed not to Carter, not to Linda, but to Ava. It was an invitation. Please deliver a lecture, How Pawns Become Queens. Linda's hands trembled as she read it aloud. Ava, quiet, traced her grandfather's carved pawn with her finger. This time it would not be about surviving Carter's onslaught or saving her mother's job. It would be about teaching the world what she already knew, that pawns carry the soul of the game. And for the first time, the world was ready to listen. 5 years had passed since a child in a simple dress had walked into a library in Greenwich and dared to move a pawn against a billionaire. 5 years since Carter Whitmore's empire had begun to bend under the quiet logic of her hand. The world had not forgotten. Headlines had come and gone. Markets had risen and fallen, but the George Whitaker Trust had endured. In Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, workshops once shuttered now rang with the rhythm of saws and hammers. Family-owned shops reopened, their signs painted bright, their windows lit against the dusk. What had been a landscape of ruin was transforming into a model of resilience. The Trust's annual report, reviewed not by bankers but by community boards, told the story in numbers that mattered. Hundreds of businesses saved, thousands of jobs preserved, apprenticeships launched for the children of steelworkers who had once thought their futures buried. And at the heart of it all was Ava Brooks. She was 14 now, taller, her hazel eyes steadier, her hair often tied back in a loose braid. She had grown into the role thrust upon her, but never lost her humility. Chess remained her compass, a discipline that kept her grounded while the world tried to crown her a prodigy. On a spring afternoon in Central Park, The Chess and Checkers house was alive with tourists, joggers, and the hum of the city's eternal pulse. Ava sat across from Carter at a well-worn stone table. The board was set. Around them, pigeons fluttered and children laughed on the playground. Carter was older now. His hair had gone almost completely white, but there was a softness in his face that once would have been unthinkable. No entourage shadowed him. No flashing ticker dictated his every breath. "Your move," Ava said, smiling. He advanced a pawn. "Do you ever think about that first game?" "Every day," she admitted. "Not because of the money. Because it showed me people can change." The match unfolded slowly, each move accompanied by stories. Carter told her about the boardroom battles, the investors who resisted, the nights when he nearly surrendered to cynicism. Ava told him about her school debates, her lectures at the Marshall Chess Club, the way children from neighborhoods like Harlem now wrote to her, asking how to fight for their own dreams. The board mirrored their words, balanced, patient, neither seeking domination but a game of beauty. As the minutes ticked away, Carter found himself in trouble. His rook had strayed too far, his pawns isolated. Ava pressed, but gently, not as a conqueror, but as a teacher. At last, she leaned forward, moved her queen, and whispered, "Checkmate." Carter looked at the board, then at her, and for the first time he laughed, not with arrogance, not with bitterness, but with genuine joy. "Well played," he said. Ava shook her head. It wasn't about winning. It was about making the game worth remembering. Weeks later, in Bethlehem, the town gathered for the dedication of a restored workshop, a wood mill once belonging to George Whitaker. The air smelled of pine and varnish, sunlight streaming through tall windows. Craftsmen demonstrated their tools. Apprentices laughed as they carried planks, and the sound of life returned to a place once silenced. Carter stood beside Ava and Linda as a brass plaque was unveiled on the front wall. Its inscription read, "Every pawn has a path. In honor of George Whitaker and all who taught us that dignity is never expendable." A hush fell as the words sank in. Linda wept quietly, clutching Ava's hand. Carter placed his palm against the plaque, eyes closed, as if asking forgiveness from the generations he had once ignored. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Carter and Ava walked alone through the workshop. Machines hummed softly, and the scent of fresh wood lingered in the air. "Do you regret it?" Ava asked gently. "All of it?" he replied. "Yes, but also no. Without my failures, I wouldn't be here. Without my blindness, I wouldn't have learned to see." He stopped, turning toward her. "One day, Ava, this board, the board of Whitmore Capital, will be yours to guide. You've already earned a non-voting seat. When you turn 21, it will be a full vote. By then, I'll be gone. But the game will still need you." Ava's eyes widened. "I'm just one person." "So is every queen," Carter said. "But she changes the board." In the years that followed, Ava's lectures traveled far beyond New York. Universities invited her, not to speak of finance, but of courage, legacy, and the power of the smallest voices. The phrase, "people first profit," spread into business schools, quoted in journals once hostile to such ideas. And yet Ava never left behind the game that had carried her there. She continued to play in Central Park, challenging strangers, teaching children, reminding them that pawns carried the soul of every battle. For Carter, the end game had arrived gently. He spent his final years not in boardrooms, but in communities his trust had saved. When his health waned, he chose Bethlehem as his last home, the town he once helped dismantle, now the town that welcomed him with quiet dignity. On a crisp autumn afternoon, He walked with Ava one last time along the Lehigh River. The smokestacks still stood, but around them the hum of workshops and laughter of families told a different story. Carter smiled faintly. I once thought legacy was conquest, but it isn't. Legacy is leaving the board better than when you sat down. Ava slipped her arm through his. Then you've learned the most beautiful move of all. When Carter Whitmore passed quietly months later, Ava returned to Central Park. She set up a chessboard at the stone table, his favorite rook resting beside the pieces. She whispered into the wind, "The game goes on." And as she moved the first pawn forward, the city around her breathed with life, carrying forward the lesson that had begun in a dark library years before. That pawns matter. That every soul, no matter how small, carries the power to transform the board. Every pawn carries a path, and every heart, no matter how small, can change the board of life. Ava's journey reminds us that true wealth is not conquest, but compassion. Not power, but legacy. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. If tales of hope, healing, and unexpected courage touch your heart, please consider subscribing so you can walk with us on the next journey of inspiration.